Hello, everyone. Welcome to this talk on John Tirole, the 2014 Nobel Laureate in Economic Sciences. And so let me introduce our speaker today. My name is Silfai Leung, the head of the Department of Economics at HKUST. So about 3 weeks ago, I was in the University of Chicago attending a memorial conference for another Nobel laureate, Gary Becker, who was my dissertation supervisor and mentor. And he passed away in May of this year at the age of 83. So at the end of the conference, I received an email from Henry, the director of the IAS, asking me if anyone in UST who is familiar with Tirole's work and who is willing to give a talk to the public audience. So I could not think of anyone other than Xiaojian, who is more familiar with Tirole's work. And actually, I believe that Xiaojian may well be the most suitable person in Hong Kong to talk about Tirole's work. So Xiaojian is currently assistant professor in the economics department of HKUST. His research areas are contract theory and economic psychology. Xiaojian joined HKUST in 2010 after receiving his PhD at the University of Mannheim in Germany. In 2008, Xiaojian visited Toulouse School of Economics, where Tirole worked, and still working as a visiting student for 1 semester. Since then, Xiaojian and Tirole have been in close contact, exchanging research ideas. For example, in Tirole's article, Cognition and Incomplete Contract, published in the American Economic Review in 2009, Tirole acknowledged Xiaojian's comments on his paper. On the other hand, Xiaojian's recent work on bounded rationality and incomplete contracts have also been discussed and cited in Tirole's own work. Before Tirole got the Nobel Prize this October, Xiaojian and others among our colleagues have been trying very hard to invite him to come to Hong Kong to visit HKUST, but he was just too busy. Now that he won the prize, it might be more difficult to invite him, but then we'll keep on trying. Hopefully we'll succeed inviting him to come to HKUST so that he'll deliver an IAS lecture all by himself. Without further ado, I'll now pass the mic to Xiaojian.
Okay, thank you for Silfai's extremely kind introduction of me. It's really my great honor to give a talk in this building talking about the Nobel Laureate Economics this year, John Tirole. Actually, yesterday, one of my colleagues told me that, do you know that Tirole will come to give a talk? Then I said, probably it's me, it's my presentation, not Tirole. Then he said, oh no, because he told all his students that Tirole will show up today. So hopefully some of you will not be so disappointed by the presenter today. So it's actually Tirole who got the prize this year, but not this person. So it's not surprising at all that Tirole eventually received the Nobel Prize. Because in economics, this person, John Tirole, appears in the reference of almost every key field in economics, ranging from pure theory to a large number of applied fields. So the question for Tirole is not whether he will receive a Nobel Prize, but when, in what area, and with whom or alone. But in the end, he got Nobel Prize alone this year. Who is Tirole? Here is a quote I borrowed from Eric Meskin, Tirole's teacher. So he said, that's not possible that one man could have written all that, and therefore John Tirole does not exist. So Tirole is an imaginary person. And there's other rumors saying that in Toulouse School of Economics, there's a secret research team And the team has more than 20 economists, and each person is a leading economist in a distinct field. And they all share the same name, John Tirole. Of course, these are rumors, but they are not completely nonsense. Because for economists, we all know that this person is extremely productive in research. So who is Tirole exactly? So here's a brief introduction of John Tirole. So he was born in 1953 in France. His father is a medicine doctor, and his mother is a professor in literature. And he did his PhD in mathematics in Paris. And then he switched to economics and obtained a PhD in MIT in economics. And then he was elected as a fellow of Econometric Society at the age of 33, the same as my age, and which is a great honor for most economists in this profession. Then in 1992, he moved from MIT to Toulouse School of Economics with a lower pay, but for a bigger dream, because the dream is more ambitious. It's to revive economics in France, and later the entire continental Europe. And then at the age of 45, he was elected as the president of Econometric Society. And then 3 years later, he was the president of the European Economic Association. Okay, so right before he got Nobel Prize this year, 2014, he also obtained this Niemeyer Economic Prize. So this Niemeyer Economic Prize was awarded to one and only one person every 2 years without having the Nobel Prize. Regarding the Nobel Prize, in the prize release, the Stockholm Committee regarded Tirole as the one of the most influential economists of our time. So in Tirole's life, I have to mention two important persons. One is Meskin, the guy who said Tirole does not exist, and the other is Lafont. Evan Meskin is only 3 years older than Tirole, and he's actually Tirole's supervisor in MIT on his thesis, Essays in Economic Theory. So that's the title of Tirole's thesis, as indeed Tirole's field of specialization. Then Tirole and Meskin have many papers on contract theory, mechanism design, and game theory, and later I will roughly introduce some of their contributions. So Evan Meskin also got a Nobel Prize in economics in 2007 due to his contribution in mechanism design. He was also the professor in social sciences in Princeton, in IAS in Princeton before. He also occupied the the former Albert Einstein's residence in Princeton. So this is Evan Meskin. The other person is Lafont, another French economist. Lafont did his PhD in Harvard using only 1 year in Harvard. Then he went to Paris to reform economics in Paris, but it was not so successful in the beginning. Then he went back to his hometown, Toulouse, and then established the Toulouse School of Economics. Tirole regarded Lafont as his mentor and also role model. Unfortunately, Lafont passed away 10 years ago. So this year, there was a European Economic Association and Econometric Society European meeting held in Toulouse in memory of the 10th anniversary of Lafont's premature death. So this year, Tirole got a Nobel Prize, and this is also the best memory of the Lafont's death, because Tirole got a Nobel Prize this year due to his contribution in the analysis of the market power and regulation. Actually, in this field, Tirole made contribution jointly with Lafont. So if Lafont had not died, then he will share the Nobel Prize with Tirole this year. Okay, so Tirole's contribution is actually defined by what he has achieved in a large number of areas in economics, ranging from pure theory, including game theory and contract theory, and some applied fields such as macroeconomics, finance, IO, industrial organization and regulation, and psychology. He's like a polymath in economics, just like the Paul Samuelson in 20th century. You know, Paul Samuelson, people argue that Paul Samuelson is the last polymath in economics, but Tirole is the first polymath in the 21st century. But his case, I mean, Tirole's case is especially very rare in modern times, just because economics has gone through a very high degree of specialization. You know, today each economist is specializing in a very narrow field, right? So it's very hard to be a polymath in modern age, but Tirole's case is an exception. Okay, so in the beginning, actually, Tirole did a lot on macroeconomics. Not many people know what he has done in macro. Actually, when the Nobel Prize this year talk about the contribution of Tirole, they mainly focus on his contribution in asset pricing. Actually, he did a lot on the rational babble in asset pricing in the beginning, and he published 2 key papers in Econometrica in 1980s. But later, he decided not to repeat himself in this field, and then he moved on to explore some new fields, such as IO, finance, and others. So this year, he got Nobel Prize alone due to his contribution in IO in general and regulation. Actually, when somebody got Nobel Prize alone, it means that he's dominant in this field. He's not only dominant, but uniquely dominant in this field, right? But in history, in IO and regulation, there's only one economist getting the Nobel Prize in this field, who is George Stigler in 1982, when Tirole just finished his thesis for a year. But at that moment, IO was very different from today, because there was no game theoretical analysis. At that moment, people just focus on the Harvard paradigm in IO. So the Harvard paradigm is just the SCP paradigm. So people talk about the structure of the market, then check the conduct of the firms, and then they investigate the performance of the market. So the entire interaction between different firms is just a black box. Since then, the field of IO has been a rapid development led by Tirole. It's just like a revolution after 1980s. So in the old days, we know that since Adam Smith, economics about the about analysis of market, right? So market is a central topic in economics. And in the old days, we know that the key paradigm in economics is actually the general equilibrium paradigm. So another French economist, Walras, initiated the paradigm called general equilibrium, and later refined by Arrow and Diderot. So Diderot is actually the fourth French economist getting the Nobel Prize. And second one is Alain paradox Alain. And the third one is Jean Tirole, the French economist getting the Nobel Prize. We know in general equilibrium paradigm, we have many restrictive assumptions. So there are so many forms and so many consumers in the market. And each form or consumer is very small. So they just take the price as given and determine the individual quantity and individual quantity demanded and individual quantity supplied, right? Then the price, the equilibrium price in the market will adjust to the level such that the aggregate quantity demanded will be equal to the quantity supplied, right? So that's the standard general equilibrium paradigm. And the key welfare implication of general equilibrium is that any competitive equilibrium is actually efficient. So this is called the first fundamental theorem of welfare economics, right? So there's no room for policy intervention, because what is there is actually what should be. There's no conflict of interest between the social interest and the individual interest. Then there are two critical problems in the old age. First of all, in the real world, when we observe the industry, it's not completely competitive. Right? In the real world, firms have market power. The big fish will eat the small fish, and small fish will eat smaller fish, right? And they don't take the price as given. And there's a strategic dependence of the firms' interaction. So this is the key problem of the general equilibrium paradigm. And the second problem is that there's information asymmetry between firms, and there's also information asymmetry between the regulatory authority and also the firms. When the regulator try to regulate the firm, they don't know the cost structure or quality of the product, right? There's an information problem. So these two problems are key problems in the old age. Then there's a paradigm shift in economics, led by Tirole, among others. So in 1980s, in I/O, Tirole stands out by unifying the framework for I/O, and he established new standard of rigor in this field. And this rigorous standard can also facilitate the realism. So this approach follows the earlier oligopoly model initiated by Cournot. Cournot is another French mathematician and philosopher. And so that's the first game theoretical model, even if there was no game theory at that moment. Then the entire methodology is changed in I/O. So they just use game theory, contract theory, information economics, and the theory of incentive to replace the old general equilibrium paradigm. So we know that this supply-demand curve is just like the totem in economics, right? Then the totem is changed to stick and carrot. We have to think about the incentives. So they shift the attention from this supply and demand to the agency consideration. Okay, then the policy recommendation is different, right? Because we know that in the competitive paradigm, what is exactly what should be. There's no room for policy, right? But in this paradigm shift, the policy recommendation suggested by Tirole is that it's complicated. It's not about his relationship, but the policy recommendation is complicated. It depends on the market structure. So in telecom industry or in banking industry and others, they have different situations. So we need to be careful. So Tirole just provided a rigorous framework for the policy advice. And that's the reason why Tirole is not so famous in mass media. He's not good at writing blogs because it's complicated, right? And it's not like the previous Nobel laureate like Stiglitz or Krugman. They are very interested in writing blogs for the public, but he's actually a very shy person. He's not interested in interacting with the public, but he can provide the toolkit for the policymaker to think about the policy issues by using theory of I/O and regulation. So after decades, his textbooks in I/O and regulation remain the most comprehensive and the best roadmap in this area. This book is written in 1980s, and this one is joined with Lafont about regulation. Okay, so not only I/O and regulation, and Tirole also rewrote the field corporate finance. So this is the textbook by Tirole in 2006. So Tirole just used theory of incentives to replace the old Modigliani and Miller paradigm. We know that in the old age, the Modigliani and Miller paradigm suggests that the capital structure is irrelevant for the value of the firm, right? And similar to the LD-Blue framework, because they have many special assumptions in this framework, then he shifted attention to the agency problem by considering the moral hazard and information asymmetry. Then when we talk about corporate finance, it's about economics of incentives and information. So this textbook is very comprehensive, and it also saves 10 years time of the graduate student. If the graduate student read original papers, which is unorganized, then it's very difficult. But this book is a very convenient roadmap for the graduate student. Following this paradigm of corporate finance, recently he also has a new book called Inside and Outside Liquidity, joined with Holmstrom. Holmstrom is the founding father of moral hazard problem, right? So these two persons follow the corporate finance paradigm and then try to provide a framework to understand what happened in the financial crisis. So this is also a textbook summarizing what they did in the past history, and then they try to provide a guideline for understanding the crisis. Okay, so you see Tirole has contributions in macroeconomics, IO and regulation, and also corporate finance. So what's the secret? So what's his secret that he can achieve so many contributions in different dimensions of the areas? The secret is actually his toolbox, the methodology, which is game theory and contract theory. We know that the paradigm shift in IO, regulation, and corporate finance is actually the result of these two methodological breakthroughs, game theory and contract theory. Right? So Tirole does not only contribute to IO and those applied fields, but also the methodology itself. So he has also contribution in game theory per se. Actually, for a person like Tirole, the boundary between applied works and some pure theory is very vague. Of course, he can apply game theory to those different areas. At the same time, the game theory can be stimulated by the new problems in I/O. Before when we talk about game theories, in 1950s, they were mainly computer scientists and mathematicians, right? But now today, when we talk about game theory, more than half of game theories are microeconomic theories, right? Just because there are new problems in economics, then based on the new problem, we need to revise game theory per se. So the boundary is actually very vague. So there are so many contributions by Tirole in game theory, but one of the contributions is very salient, which is his invention of the solution concept PBE, perfect Bayesian equilibrium. So this is the solution concept of the dynamic game of incomplete information. Probably you don't know this solution concept, especially when you are not an economics student. But probably you know this Beautiful Mind, right? This is a movie talking about John Nash. This is a Hollywood movie. John Nash got Nobel Prize in 1994, joined with Hasai and Shelton due to his contribution in the equilibrium concept in games. And he also had some problem of the mental illness. He has a schizophrenia. This is a hallucination or delusion problem of John Nash. And so actually he just applied the Kakutani's fixed point theory to economic problems and defined a new solution concept called Nash equilibrium. But for Nash equilibrium, there are two important elements missing. One is time. The other is information. And sometimes in I/O, the forms that do not move simultaneously, right? The incumbent may set the price first, and then there are follow-up entrants to interact with the incumbent. So this is a sequential move, right? And sometimes, when we talk about regulation, the regulator does not know the cost structure, so there's also information problem. They don't know what game to play. They're facing the uncertainty of games. So loosely speaking, PBE is nothing but Nash equilibrium plus these two important elements, time and information. Of course, there are also many other contributions in game theory by Tirole, like the collective reputation and others, but I don't have time to cover all of them here. So this is a textbook by Tirole. game theory. So this textbook was written in 1990s, joined with Joe Fundenberg. Fundenberg is also the student of Eric Meskin. But still, I mean, this textbook is the most comprehensive textbook in game theory at the graduate level. So if you are doing microeconomics, basically you can find everything you want in this textbook. So this is game theory, highly abstract, but contract theory here is less abstract, but still covers a large class of economic problems. So the key paradigm in contract is the complete contracting paradigm. There are problems like adverse selection, signaling, screening, and moral hazard. And those problems are already well documented in the standard textbook. Right? If you go to even the undergraduate textbook, we still cover those problems. Right? They're very standard. Actually, you can see most of them got Nobel Prize in this field, like Akerlof, Spence, Morley, Stiglitz, except Holmstrom. And Holmstrom, I think Holmstrom will get the Nobel Prize one of the days in the future, because moral hazard is still very active in research and also well established in the field. Okay, so the first problem is called hidden information. So here, there's the information asymmetry between two contracting parties. Then we know from Akerlof that if there's a market for lemons, right, the market will break down. So this is something we should be careful. So information is something we cannot ignore, right? Then in order to overcome the information asymmetry between two contracting parties, we need to use some device called signaling device or screening device. The signal device is that the informed party can actively send some costly signal to show his type to the uninformed party. And so there are labor market example by Spence, and Meskin and Tirole just elaborate the signaling model by considering the informed principal problem. And screening is the reverse timing, right? So the uninformed party can propose a menu. Even if he has no information about the type of the other party, he can provide a menu and let the informed party self-select, right? And then there are regulators problem. There are papers by Lafont and Tirole, and also Barron and Meyerson. And in this case, even if you don't know the cost structure of the forms, the regulator can, elicit the private information by the contract design. The other problem is called hidden actions. So in this case, there's information asymmetry not about some exogenous characteristic of the contracting parties, but some endogenous actions. So you cannot control the action of the agent or employees in the contract, then you can design the incentive and let the outcome, let the pay to the agent depend on the outcome. And outcome realization is associated with the effort. So in this case, we need to design the high incentive power contract to incentivize the agent to work very hard. So Holmstrom is the founding father of moral hazard. Then Tirole just extends the standard moral hazard problem into a more general problem, like collusion. So sometimes there are more than one agents. Then we have to make sure that the regulator will not collude with the forms, right? We need to make sure there's a regulator's independence. Then we need to consider the collusion proofness in the optimal contract. Then that's the reason why in the real world, we cannot observe extremely high incentive power. Because if the incentive power is too high, then there will be collusion between the form and the regulator. Later, Tirole also extend the moral hazard problem to dynamic setting, like Korean concern, joined with Diatripon, Juvi, and others. So Diatripon is also the student of Eric Meskin. We know that in economics, there are two great teachers in research. One is Eric Meskin, the other is Lafont. And fortunately, Tirole is the student of both of them. Right? That's the reason why he's so great. The last wave of contract theory. It's called incomplete contracting paradigm. So this is initiated by Grossman and Hart and Moore. So they argue that there's a new problem called verifiability. Even if the contracting parties can observe some contingencies or actions, but the court of law cannot observe it. So it's hard to verify whether they have already delivered sufficient effort or not, right? Then there will be a problem of hold up. Because if you have already delivered sufficient effort, then the other contracting party will say that it's not sufficient, right? Then taking into account, you'll have the under-investment ex ante. Then the incomplete contracting paradigm just focus on the allocation of ownership and control in order to mitigate the under-investment problem due to verifiability. But the problem in this paradigm is that they just compare different practical institutions. They just observe what we have in practice, then compare these institutions, then they try to achieve the question, which institution is better? And the question is which, but not what. So this is the key critique by Tirole. And he and Meskin, among others, used the mechanism design approach to show that, okay, you consider verifiability problem, it's fine. This is really a key problem. But we still can design the optimal contract to achieve the first best. So the verifiability under many conditions is not a key problem, right? Then the incomplete contract theory argued that, okay, you can design the optimal mechanism, but it's not so realistic because we cannot observe those mechanisms in the real world. But they argue that, okay, even if they are not realistic, I mean, it's not a problem to motivate the allocation of control and ownership, right? There are some other problem to drive the result. Then Tirole, and again, also use this complete contracting approach or mechanism design approach to study some institutional design like authority. So they can design the optimal institution. And then we found that the optimal institution in the real world is nothing but authority we observe in practice. Okay, so but this paradigm appears to be in the old incomplete contracting paradigm. Because in the old age, we just compare different institutions, then study which one is better. Then using the optimal contract, we can still find the optimal contract, which is nothing but what we observe in reality. So there was a debate in the past decades about which paradigm we should adopt, the incomplete contract paradigm or complete contracting paradigm. And then in the end, in 1992, Tirole has a review paper called Incomplete Contract, Where Do We Stand? And this paper can be regarded as the terminator in the entire field about the debate. So after this review paper, there was not much progress in the debate until after 10 years, Tirole introduced the second generation incomplete contract model using the cognitive approach. So this approach is closer to psychology and economics. So the final critique to those paradigms is that we can design the optimal contract using mechanism design approach, but it's not realistic. Then people argue that why people do not adopt those mechanisms, then probably they are bounded irrational. But still we need a model of bounded rationality. So game theory and concept theory is very successful as a methodology, right? But still there are many critiques to game theory and contract theory. And one of the main critiques is that people are not perfectly rational, right? We make mistakes, and we make the mistakes in a systematic way. So our brain is actually not a machine, right? Even if Meskin and Tirole can design the optimal institution, but it's too complicated. People cannot use it. It's too complicated. We are not a machine, right? Then this leads to the rise of a new field. And the new field is called behavior economics. So in behavior economics, the brain is not like this, but something like this. people are not as smart as we thought. We make systematic mistakes, and we can find many empirical observations to justify why people are irrational. Okay? So then, especially after Kalman got Nobel Prize in 2002, this literature boom. There are so many people moving into behavior economics to model some psychological effect and borrow those psychological effects into the economic model. Then the outcome is very realistic, and it can be more fitting to the data. But the problem today is that there's overload in modeling choices in behavior economics. For Tirole, well, it's really important in this field to let 1,000 of flowers bloom, or let the bully fly in the beginning, right? But in the end, there are so many behavior models, right? It's different from information asymmetry. Because when we introduce information asymmetry in the general equilibrium model, we find that the market breaks down. This is the first order important issue we should care about. But when we study behavior economics, of course, the result will be more realistic, but it's second order matter, right? And more importantly, people can be rational in only one way, but people can be irrational in infinity ways, right? There are so many models, and depending on different scenario, we need to model different psychological biases. So we don't have any single unifying framework in this field. So eventually, in the 21st century, Tirole also entered this field, behavior economics, but they call it psychology and economics. They don't call it behavior economics, because everything is all about behavior, right? Then he attempts to provide a unifying framework to synthesize what we observe in behavior economics. So there are lots of contributions in this area, like signal jamming, self-signaling, and social signaling, right? So this is something we should care about in the future research direction. It's similar to other fields, like incomplete contract paradigm. By introducing the incomplete contract, it's for the practical purpose, right? For the practical purpose, we need to focus our attention on reality. But in the end, we still need the mechanism design approach as a foundation. Even if we get back to macroeconomics, to about Keynesianism, right? So in the end, we still need the micro foundation for the Keynesian model. So now comes behavior economics. We can introduce those biases. Then in the end, we also need a micro foundation of those biases, right? Some biases may be linked to each other, and there can be some functional roles of some biases. Maybe some bias is biased at a single case, but in the long run, some psychological feature may be energy saving, and it can have an instrumental value, right? So we need a foundation for psychology and economics. His paper, Intrinsic and Extrinsic Motivation, is actually one of the best papers in IAS. When the journal celebrated the 80-year history in 2013. So intrinsic motivation is something we should care about. Of course, we need to design the explicit incentive to motivate the agent to do the right thing, right? In the old days, when we are in the general equilibrium paradigm, there's no incentive provided, then the policy must be misleading, right? Then we consider agency problem in IO, regulation, and corporate finance, right? Then we can design the incentive appropriately to motivate individuals. However, we are human beings, right? We cannot ignore the driving force from inside. The true incentive, economics is in essence about incentives, right? But the true incentive is not only about stick and carrot, but also about how to set life on fire, right? Then we need to combine intrinsic motivation and extrinsic motivation. Then you can hit the target this way, right? So Tirole recently is writing his next book called Egonomics. Ego is something we borrow from Freud, right? Not economics. So joined with Roland and Bonabou. So this is Tirole's next textbook. He has already 11 textbooks, but this one is in preparation. And in the future, the more ambitious goal for Tirole is to provide an integrated framework about social sciences, not only about psychology and economics. It should also include anthropology, psychology, and sociology. And for those who are interested in Tirole's this last category of intellectual adventure, you are more than welcome to participate in my course offered next spring about topics in psychology and economics. Okay, so we talk about general equilibrium paradigm, game theory, and contrast theory, and also behavioral economics. Then the more fundamental question is, what is a good model, right? What's the criteria of modeling? Here is the Stigler's 3 criteria of judging economic theories. There are 3 dimensions. One is the precision of prediction and explanation. Right? This is scientific model, right? There must be some empirical content involved. And it should be a general model, right? A map is a model, and it's good to have a world map to know the entire world. You are not interested in a map of my kitchen, right? So this is very specific. So we need a general model, and the model should be simple and tractable. So if we really need to have a very realistic model, like a map, then it cannot be a one-to-one mapping between the world, the real world, and the map. Otherwise, you have to copy another planet. Right? The model must be simple. Okay, so general equilibrium theory. I mean, based on the comparative paradigm, the policy recommendation is misleading, right? And so it's not a good model for policy realism. And it's called general equilibrium. Actually, it's better to call it special equilibrium because there are so many special assumptions, right? There are so many forms, they don't have market power, there's no information problem, there's no externality, and so on. So it's very special, but it's really simple. It's a beautiful model. Beautiful, simple, you can rely on the model to know where we are. It's a good benchmark, right? Then comes the paradigm shift led by Tirole and among others, which is game theory and contrast theory. And we can use the game theory and contrast theory to provide a rigorous framework for policy advice. So it's also a good model for prediction, and it's general. So game theory is very general. It's not only about economics, but also many other social problems, right? And it's also simple and tractable, right? Then comes the critique to game theory. People are not rational. We need to make it more realistic. Then comes behavioral economics. And this field is really better in terms of prediction and explanation, right? However, we have to sacrifice the other 2 dimensions because it's not general. Depending on the different context, we need to model different psychological biases, right? And it's not simple at all. There's no unifying framework. And that's the reason why Bonabo and Tirole came to this field to provide a more general model and try to integrate psychology into economics by saving these 2 dimensions, okay? So we have already some rough idea about what's special about Tirole's work. Now I want to make it more concrete. We know that in science, there are 2 dimensions to judge the scientific contribution. One is that whether the scientific work can be understood from the fundamental perspective, right? You can give us some fundamental view of the world. And secondly, we care about whether this scientific research can give us some immediate benefit to the society, okay? So 2 by 2, there are 4 categories, 2 dimensions, right? In each dimension, there are 2 values. So here is a category called Pasteur's Quadrant. This is a label. And this is a label to define a class of scientific research that can give you both fundamental understanding of the world and practical use at the same time. Okay, so this is named by Pasteur's creation of a new field called microbiology, and it also gives us the successful application in vaccination. Okay, now comes the example in physics. 2 by 2, there are 4 categories, and in the horizontal dimension, it's about whether this research can give you some practical use. Okay, then the second dimension is about fundamental understanding. We know Newton is here. Newton is here because Newton shared with Leibniz about the development of calculus. Calculus is something very fundamental, right? And Newton also laid the foundation of classical mechanics. So today we have to rely on Newton everywhere when we construct a building. So when we send a satellite to the space, we need to rely on Newton's contribution, right? Okay, so this is Newton, and the other is Watt. Watt does not give us any fundamental understanding to the nature, right? Even if his improvement of the steam engine is very important, leading to industrial revolution, right? But it does not involve much about the nature of the universe. It's very practical. The other categories is Minkowski. Minkowski, so he's the inventor of the notion 4-dimensional space-time, right? Very important person in physics. But as far as I know, there has been not much application of his 4-dimensional space-time. Of course, there's application in science fiction. Recently, the movie Interstellar, right? So basically, it's about his notion of 4-dimensional space-time. But so far, there's not much successful application. Okay, now comes economics. John Tirole is here. So Tirole is in the Pasteur's Quadrant. Now he laid down the foundation for game theory, contract theory, and at the same time, he applied game theory and contract theory to I/O, regulation, finance, macro, and recently psychology, right? So he's the right person in the modern time. The others like Buffett, he's just a successful investor, right? So we don't know his name in textbook, and you cannot learn much from him. But Ullman is another category. Ullman actually got Nobel Prize in economics in 2005, shared with Thomas Schelling, due to his contribution in understanding conflict. Actually, he's a great game theorist. He has contribution in the extension of Nash equilibrium, correlated equilibrium. Sometimes we can improve the welfare by using his correlated equilibrium. And he also made contribution in repeated games. And his notion, common knowledge, is just very beautiful. But so far, there's not much application. Okay, so here I want to give some of my personal remarks. For some research, probably like Ullman here, there's not much practical application immediately, but maybe there's a time lag, right? It takes time. For example, Minkowski, he has a very famous student. Who is his student? Albert Einstein. Of course, Einstein is also more or less this category, but his contribution can also give us nuclear power. No matter nuclear power is good or bad for society, at least there's a practical application today, right? For Ullman, not many people know that he did his PhD in mathematics, and he was doing a branch of mathematics, knot theory. Knot theory is pure mathematics. And there was not much application at that time, but recently people found that his exercise in knot theory can be applied successfully in understanding genetic codes. So when we understand the code of DNA, we need to get back to Ullman's knot theory half century ago. Okay, so I don't have to define this category, right? Actually, it's very easy for you to find some of your colleagues or your professors in this category. Okay. Okay, so this is a summary. So Tirole provides a unifying framework for tractable research and also teaching, right, by many textbooks, and also a framework of rigor for policy advice. Tirole is still very active now in advancing social sciences, mainly economics. And last month, he sent me a paper about cognitive games and cognitive traps. So this is a unifying model covering a large class of economic problems, including zero-sum games, coordination games, trade games, incomplete contracting approach, the second generation one, and also memory management in psychology. We all know that his next textbook, Joined with Roland Bonabou, is in progress. So let's see what he can contribute in the next years in social sciences in general. So this is the last slide. After he got the Nobel Prize, there are so many congratulations to Tirole, right? Then he has a reply to all, and he said, I'm over the moon and haven't quite touched back down to Earth yet. And after this absolutely wonderful moment, I will try to return to what we enjoy most, doing research, interacting with friends, colleagues, and students. So at the end of the day, Tirole is still a researcher doing research and teaching. So that's something we all should have keep in mind as a scholar. Okay, so I'm open to questions, but I'm not sure whether I can answer all aspects of his research by Tirole, except Tirole himself. Due to my limitation, please excuse me if I omit some of his contributions in economics and finance. So in the future, hopefully we can successfully invite John Tirole to come to HKUST to give a talk in IAS, and soon, hopefully. Thank you. Yes?
Well, can you briefly introduce the social signaling? Does it mean that the people's irrationality will be partly influenced by the social network?
Okay, so he has some work about social signaling in this category, right? So sometimes, when we do something good for society, it's not for money, right? It's for a meaning. Sometimes we have social signal. We want to define who we are, right, by the correct action. But sometimes, we want to signal to the society that what kind of person we are. So if you, for example, like the blood donation, right? There is experimental evidence showing that if you give money to the blood donator, then this will crowd out the social signaling device. Because sometimes, they denote their blood to the society because they want to signal to society they are a generous person, right? But if you give money to the person who denote, this may be a signal. You denote the blood just for money, not for the good of the society. Then this person will run away, right? So this is a kind of example to show that we cannot rely too much on the extreme motivation. Sometimes the social signaling can let people do the right thing. Yes.
So thank you for introducing Tirole to us and his many different contributions. But usually someone awarded for Nobel Prize is awarded for a particular discovery or a particular impact. And can you elaborate more his contribution on regulation and market power?
Okay, so in regulation, I'm not in this field, but I can give you some limited understanding from my perspective. In this field, previously when we talk about regulation, it's about something like rate of return or price cap, right? But this kind of regulation will ignore completely the incentive concern from the firm's perspective. If you use the rate of return as a regulation instrument, then the form will be rationally circumventing this policy. They can always spend money in the other direction, then in the end it's less efficient compared to his mechanism design approach. Regarding regulation, I mean, there's also a famous Chicago school in economics. Sometimes, they argue that there's no need to intervene in the market, and the policy implication is actually, laissez-faire, just like the market run. And it can, even if it is sick, then it can get back by itself, right? But this is not the implication by Tirole. He said we should be careful. We should not rely on the ideological base to give the policy, right? Sometimes we need to be careful. Depending on different situation, you need to give the different policy recommendation. So it's not the ideological debate. Otherwise, like Krugman, Stiglitz, they are very active in the public, but it's not based on the rigorous analysis. So he just provided a framework to let the regulator use his handbook to give the policy. Yeah. But I cannot talk too much about the details about his research. Right.
How about market power?
Market power, right. So he had some contribution about regulation, right? But this can be the regulation to the monopoly, right? His oligopoly model is about interaction of different forms. So this is a framework to analyze I/O. But his market power can regulate Google and Yahoo and so on. So this is a very powerful instrument at the current stage. Because in the US, people, maybe European policy is very different from the US competition policy. European competition policy has already borrowed a lot from Tirole's framework. But the US is a little bit different.
Thanks for the great talk. And I'm not much exposed to the behavior economics. So, but from the perspective of traditional economics about like maximizing or minimizing some issues. So, for if it is like people are irrational, how can you model this irrationality? Are you still modeling from a rational perspective, or is there any kind of new model? Or how can you model this irrationality?
Okay, so right, this is so you should come to my lecture next week. So when we model irrationality, of course, we need a benchmark. Still, the benchmark is a rational model, right? Still a rational model. Then we analyze irrational behavior based on some evidence, right? There's many dimensions of irrational behavior. Let me take an example, like a time-inconsistent preference. Sometimes, your review choice cannot satisfy the consistency over time, intertemporally. Then this is very easy to say that people are irrational, because people can be irrational in many ways. Then we need to make a sharp prediction of in which direction people are irrational. Then people focus on present bias. When we maximize your utility intertemporally, in each period, maybe you overweight the current gratification. So this is one example of modeling irrational behavior. Because in each period, you have a different preference, and your preference will be inconsistent over time. And in each period, the current gratification will be more salient. Right? So we still need to rely on the benchmark of the rational behavior, but there's some modification of the model. Yeah.
Okay, so let us thank Xiaojian for preparing for this lecture and for all the time and the knowledge for the performance. Thank you.